Hi, it's April 21st. I hope you're all staying safe and not getting too stir crazy. So this is going to be a very short lecture on why it is that it's so important to keep the output gap zero. That is to keep the level of aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. So let me define the output gap here first. Uh, if this is the natural level of output, and if this is aggregate demand, which of course ends up being equal to the actual level of GDP, then this is the output gap. And what I've drawn here is a positive output gap. So I'll talk first about why a positive output gap is bad, and then I'll talk about why a negative output gap is bad. And quite honestly, this goes back to our historical experience. Macroeconomists can make theories about why it's bad to have a non-zero output gap, but the reason they actually believe it is because of the historical experience. So, two examples here. There was the great inflation of the 1970s. So, if this is 1970 and that's 1980, inflation, and here I'll put inflation on the axis. So, inflation started going up somewhat in the 60s. It got higher and higher in the 70s. It was way up in double digit. And then Volcker brought it down, who was a head of the Fed, then brought it down in the 1980s, and then it came down. But people felt this was very unpleasant to have double-digit inflation. Double-digit just means more than 10% here. So that's seared into the memory of macroeconomists. We think about that a lot. Now, could have been a lot worse, and it has been worse. So think of the German hyperinflation. Not only did that kind of wipe out the value of all the money and people had to rush to take their cash to spend it before it lost all its value, but that kind of social disorder was materially helping folks like Hitler come to power, not just folks like Hitler, but Hitler himself. And so it's, that hyperinflation is even worse than this. And you say, why did people hate inflation so much? Well, go back to the lecture about costs of inflation. And in addition, of course, to the genuine costs of inflation, people blame inflation for things it doesn't do. But for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, it was pretty unpleasant to have inflation really high. Back in the 70s in the US and in the various episodes of hyperinflation around the world, of which I mentioned the German hyperinflation. So basically, a positive output gap, you're worried about too much inflation. And in particular, inflation going up and up and up. Inflation only stopped going up when Volcker made a negative output gap for a while. Okay, so now let's talk about what's bad about a negative output gap. So let me draw a picture of a negative output gap. Suppose that's the natural level of output, and suppose this is the actual level of output. This is now a negative output gap. Okay, now, to understand why a negative output gap is really bad, you really want to understand that low output is also associated with low employment and high unemployment. So it's a negative output gap is especially painful because a lot of people are out of work. They can't get jobs that they want, even worse than normal. Even at the natural level of output, you still have that labor market imperfection wedge, but things are worse when there's a negative output gap. And so lots of unemployment. And so two examples of a negative output gap were the Great Depression in the 1930s and the Great Recession starting in 2008. Great Depression was worse, but they were both very painful. And if you talk to some of your older relatives, you'll hear about some of the pain that was there during the Great Recession. So, and I encourage you to do that. So a negative output gap leads to lots of unemployment, and low GDP means people's profits are low. A lot of things are bad. Think of everything we talked about in why people want jobs. All of that's bad when you've got this negative output gap, and needlessly so. Okay, maybe you want a negative output gap temporarily to get inflation down, but once we've got inflation at our target, and for the moment let's imagine a 2% target of inflation like the Fed has, keeping the output gap zero is exactly what it takes to keep inflation the same. If we have a 2% inflation target, and that's what we want to keep, the way to do it, the way to keep inflation at 2% is to keep that output gap at zero. Now, when I say 2% inflation, I really mean the inflation that's driven by the sticky prices. There's some flexible prices, like people talk about food prices and energy prices as being flexible prices. They'll go up and down, and a lot of that, people care, but you want to treat that as kind of noise in relation to the inflation target, and the Fed does. The Fed is pretty good about this. It talks about core inflation. Let's look at the inflation rate for the sticky prices. Let's look past the noise that comes from food and energy prices going up and down. And that's the right thing to do, I believe. So I'm in tune with the Fed on that. So, but those underlying sticky prices giving you this underlying 2% rate of inflation, the way you keep that true is by having a zero output gap. So the Great Depression was one of the times when it was bad, when we saw the bad consequences of a negative output gap, and the Great Recession was another. So this was, started in 2008, and then the Great Depression was in the 30s. I guess it kind of started in 1929. So that's it. That's why we want to keep the output gap zero. Positive output gap will eventually give us too much inflation. Negative output gap will give us a lot of unemployment. These are both painful. And I should say, cycling between them isn't so great either. If you say, oh, well, we'll have a positive output gap, we'll get really high employment, then let's go to a negative output gap to bring the inflation back down. Well, the extra unemployment is kind of more painful than the reduced unemployment is nice, or I could say it lots of different ways. The higher GDP isn't quite as nice as the lower GDP is painful. So just fluctuating and having sometimes a positive output gap and sometimes a negative output gap, that's not so great either. But so the right thing to do is to keep the output gap zero, which keeps the core underlying inflation rate steady. And any central bank that really does that, that's going to be a great thing. In fact, as you can see from the historical record, the Fed's record on this front has been somewhat spotty. There's another thing that's my own research with co-authors has focused on too. The Fed has also had a quite spotty record in trying to adjust to changes in the natural level of output, like when there's an improvement in technology, making sure that aggregate demand goes up. What happens in that case? So these are not episodes that are so famous, but they're there in the data. What happens is if you don't increase aggregate demand, then you'll get when you have an improvement in technology, you'll have the same output with fewer inputs, meaning people are thrown out of work. They they can't get jobs. So what you want to happen with better technology is to have more output for the same inputs. That is, people stay employed and you just have more stuff, and it's all wonderful. If the Fed does its job, that's what happens. If the Fed doesn't do its job, which historically has happened way, way, way too often, the GDP stays about the same, and then people get thrown out of work because you have an improvement in technology. This is simply stupid, and yet it's happened a lot, many, many times in the historical record. Again, not quite as famous in terms of people's awareness as things like the Great Depression, Great Recession, and the Great Inflation, and the various hyperinflations around the world. But this not adjusting aggregate demand appropriately when the natural rate of output goes up because of technology has been a big failing on the part of the Fed. So we can hope that it's going to do better in the future. And what signs I see, of course I'm an optimist, but what signs I see suggest that the Fed is starting to do a little bit better on some of these fronts. But, of course, in terms of simply avoiding big negative output gaps that aren't caused by improvements in technology, I think the Fed is still making a big mistake by not being comfortable enough with negative interest rates. Hopefully that will also change. But two big improvements in Fed policy relative to mistakes they've been making would be to respond appropriately by cutting rates more when there's an improvement in technology and being willing to use negative rates. Now, again, I'm an optimist. Things do get better. One of the things that the Fed has gotten better at is fighting inflation. The Fed, I don't think, is in any danger of letting inflation get to double digits anymore. The principles and the attitudes for fighting inflation are actually quite good. What we need are good attitudes towards fighting negative output gaps, including the willingness to use negative rates, and just having more of an appropriate understanding of how monetary policy should respond to technological improvements. Thanks for listening. Stay safe.